Hello, and welcome to the 2022 Virginia Festival of the Book, presenting Seeing Trees, Saving the Great Forests. I'm Jane Kulo, Director of the Virginia Center for the Book, a program of Virginia Humanities. Thanks for joining us. I have a couple of notes before we begin. Please share your questions for the authors using the Q&A tab on Zoom. This event has optional closed captioning, which you can turn on and customize at any time with the tab at the bottom of your window. If you haven't already read today's books, we hope you will. For details about how to buy them from a local bookseller, visit vabook.org, where you can also explore the schedule of upcoming programs and watch past events. While you're there, please consider making a donation to support the festival's ongoing work at vabook.org/give. We greatly appreciate the support of our sponsor for this event, Westminster Canterbury of the Blue Ridge, which has also added these books to its library. Thank you to the Charlottesville area tree stewards for sharing this event with their community. And thank you to our bookseller for this event, Fountain Bookstore in Richmond. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Meg Lowman, author of The Arbornaut, is a biologist, educator, ecologist, writer, editor, and public speaker. Nicknamed the real-life Lorax by National Geographic and Einstein of the Treetops by the Wall Street Journal, she is the executive director of the Tree Foundation. John W. Reid, author of Evergreen, is a conservationist and economist whose writing has appeared in outlets including the New York Times and Scientific American. He is currently senior economist at Nia Taro, an organization that supports Indigenous guardianship of vital ecosystems. Our moderator, Michelle Nijhuis, is author of Beloved Beasts, Fighting for Life in an Age of Extinction, a project editor at The Atlantic, a contributing editor at High Country News, and an award-winning reporter whose work has been published in National Geographic and the New York Times Magazine. She is co-editor of the Science Writer's Handbook and lives in Washington. Thank you all for joining us today. Michelle, it's all yours.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. Welcome to the festival. These books, both of these books I really love, not just because they're great books about trees, but they're great books about the diverse and complex relationships between trees and people. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Before we start though, sadly, we are not joined by John's co-author, Tom Lovejoy, who passed away late last year. Meg also worked with Tom, and he was a real icon in the field of conservation biology and conservation in general. So John and Meg, would you like to take a couple of minutes to remember Tom and talk about his legacy?
Sure. I guess I could go first since I knew Tom from my youth. At age 16, he became a mentor to me. I was so fortunate to meet him through some internships as a young child, and he was always there for me and very dedicated to the Amazon, which ultimately became a habitat of concern for me. And I will say, you know, his reputation is global, and his bow ties were everywhere around the world. He and I spoke at so many conferences from India to Indonesia to Washington, and it was a huge loss for the world of tropical rainforest conservation, which is my passion. And I'm not sure if anyone can step in those shoes. So we are truly mourning that loss, but celebrating the fact that he mentored so many people like myself along the way. And we're really grateful for that. Thank you for letting us speak to him.
Of course, John.
Thanks. I was mentored by Tom late in the game. We had known each other at a distance, being both in the conservation world. But it wasn't until a friend sort of pushed us together several years ago, really for this project, saying that we, with our own different backgrounds and different sort of takes on conservation, saw the importance of big forests. And Tom, of course, has been talking about forest fragmentation and the importance of forest as big biological and physical systems since the 70s. I had my epiphanies of more recent vintage, but we came together, and it was such a gift to me to be able to work with somebody who is really truly was one of the elders in our field. And Tom never seemed old, never looked old, would probably bristle at the title elder, but it really is what he was. He was such a great guide, and he knew the history of everything, how we had gotten to this stage that we are in the conservation struggle. So I'm just deeply grateful to have had the opportunity to work with him. Back to you, Michelle.
Yeah, well, his voice really comes through in Evergreen, which is such a great combination of your perspectives. I think we'll start off with a short reading from each of you and just a bit of overview of each of your projects. John, since we were just talking about Tom, maybe you can bring your combined voice into the discussion.
So I'm reading from the very beginning of Evergreen, and this is the prologue. It's called Anastasias Woods. Birds of paradise and crossed hatchets decorate her yellow party dress. Bare feet pick a path over roots and rocks and quilts of moist leaves. Little brown hands grip ferns for balance as she lowers herself down a slope so steep you can reach sideways and touch the earth. She weaves through gaps in shoulder-high limestone, ancient corals that were compressed until they had nowhere to go but up and into a new career as mountains. The girl's feet seem scarcely to feel the brittle edges. She turns her close-cropped head and gives us a smile, then disappears down the path. Anastasia is a 2-year-old member of the Momo clan, which, for generations beyond reckoning, has lived in this forest in Western New Guinea. She is accompanied by her mother, Sopiana Yesnath, a family friend named Mariana Hai, and Anastasia's aunt, Finche Momo, who is shadowed by a limping, pointy-eared hunting dog named Hunter. Several visitors scramble to keep up. The way leads into leafy gullies and along a toothy forested ridge. After 3 hours, we arrive at a flat spot just big enough for our tents and a fire. Nearby, a clear stream flows over a bed of limestone bulbs formed by the calcium carbonate of ancient shells and exoskeletons that dissolved further up the mountain. So we start the book in the middle of a megaforest, which is one of 5 remaining areas in the world where trees cover areas that are at the scale of, in the case of New Guinea, a whole island, and in the case of the other 5, big parts of continents or whole continents. And they are 2 boreal forests in the Russia and Scandinavia, the taiga, the North American boreal, which is in Alaska and Canada, and then 3 tropical forests, the Amazon, the Congo, and the forest that you were just in that excerpt. And what Tom and I strove to do with this book is to bring some immediacy to these places, to show that they're still there with all their vitality, their species, their physical and biological processes churning, that they're in trouble, and that there are very practical things that can be done to save them, and by saving them, to save our planet. The title of the book is not hyperbole. It's really our planet can't fully function in terms of its climate and in terms of its biodiversity, and even in terms of culture without these spaces. So that was what we tried to do with Evergreen, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, John. Meg, would you like to take us into the treetops that you're sitting in?
Sure, I would love to. I'd love to take you here right now in the Amazon at 125 feet up. So I too will read from the beginning, which is entitled How to See the Whole Tree and What That Means for the Forest. Imagine going to the doctor for a complete checkup, and in the course of an entire visit, the only body part examined was your big toe. The visit ends with a pronouncement that you are perfectly healthy, but there was no test of your vital signs, heartbeat, vision, or any other part of you, just your big toe. You may have gone in with a broken arm or a headache from high blood pressure, but the assessment of your lowest bipedal extremity alone couldn't clue the doctor into your real trouble. How would you feel? At the very least, you'd probably switch doctors. For centuries, the health of trees, even those ancient giants stretching hundreds of feet into the clouds, was assessed in just the same way. Examining woody trunks at eye level, scientists essentially inspected the big toes of their patients and then made sweeping deductions about forest health without ever gazing at the bulk of the tree, known as the canopy, growing overhead. The only time foresters had the chance to evaluate a whole tree was when it was cut down, kind of like assessing a person's entire medical history from a few ashes after cremation. In tropical forests especially, the lower levels are as different from the upper reaches as night and day. The ground receives as little as 1% of the light shining on the crowns, so the understory is dark, windless, and often humid, whereas the canopy is blasted with sun, whipped by high winds, and often crispy in its dryness between rain. The gloomy forest floor is inhabited by a few shade-loving creatures, while the canopy hosts a riotous variety of life. Millions of species of every imaginable color, shape, and size that pollinate flowers, eat leaves, and also eat each other. Before the 1980s, foresters unimaginatively overlooked 95% of their subject. Almost no one paid attention to the treetops. Then in 1978, a young botanist with a lifelong passion for green giants and infatuated by leaves arrived in Australia on a fellowship to study tropical forests. Coming from the temperate zones, this neophyte knew almost nothing about the tropics. During her first visit to a rainforest in Australia, she stared up into the most dizzyingly tall tree she'd ever met and thought, holy cow, I can't even see the top. That gobsmacked botanist was me. So that was kind of how the book starts, and of course unfolds into the story of being one of the first Arbornauts in the world. The term Arbornaut, of course, comes from tree explorer. We have astronauts who explored outer space. In the 1960s, we have scuba gear invented in the 1950s for aquanauts, but we never had real science in the canopy till the 1980s, making it one of the newest and perhaps underfunded, I might admit, sciences in the world. Yet we now know that half of the species in the terrestrial part of the world planet live up there. So I chronicled my adventures in different countries, mostly a last gasp for places like Ethiopia and Malaysia, where forests are disappearing so quickly. And my real reason for writing a memoir was to hope that girls would learn from me. I had a pretty awful time as a woman in science, usually the only female on most expeditions and in most departments. And so I feel if people could learn from my misadventures, as I call them, then maybe we can get more diversity and inclusivity in science, especially Indigenous people where I'm working now. The last chapter describes a project of hope that I call Mission Green, where we hope to hire Indigenous women and families to operate canopy walkways for ecotourism, which is a much better sustainable income than logging. So that's kind of the whole, little summary of the book. And I'm really honored to be here having a chat with Tom up in heaven near the canopy and
Yeah.
John, the co-author. Thanks.
Thanks, Meg. So I had the pleasure of reading these two wonderful books in succession, and so to speak. And as I and as I was reading them, it occurred to me that both of you are talking about somewhat unexplored territory. Meg, as you said, you were one of the first researchers to head into the canopy, and John, you're writing about these forests that are obviously intimately known by the people who live in them, but up until a few decades ago, the extent of them wasn't well understood, because satellite mapping has allowed us to really grasp how large these forests are. So could you just say a little bit about what we've learned, how that changes our understanding of forests?
Yeah, well, as you say, there really has been a revolution in just as Meg has brought a revolution in seeing the canopy up close. Technology has brought us a revolution in seeing the forest from space, and being able to tell highly nuanced differences between forests. So in there are a set of satellites that the United States has had going around the planet since the 70s, but only in the early 2000s did they make the data publicly available to anybody who wanted to use it. At the same time, you had a computing revolution coming with Google building huge supercomputers, and you had people on the ground. And the first of these teams were Russian scientists and activists who were reacting to an onslaught of logging in European Russia. And all these threads came together to where people could start to see not just a continuous green canopy, but where the forest was most intact, where it had been spared the fragmenting effects of roads and other sorts of industrial development. And then people started to go in there and say, well, what's going on in these forests? How much carbon do they have? How are the species doing? And this, of course, dovetailed with research that Tom started in the Amazon in the 70s. And what people discovered was, in a way, not surprising, but confirmed our suspicions that forests that were most intact had more carbon than forests that were fragmented. In the tropics, it's up to twice as much carbon. And it's held much more securely because they don't have a lot of edges. They're less prone to fire, they're less prone to drying out, they're less prone to wind throw. And so this carbon is held securely. We also were able to see which species can tolerate fragmentation and which species need a deep forest interior to thrive. And at the same time, I think what's more recent really is people coming to see that human cultures to thrive and maintain their integrity and their languages often need these secure forest spaces, not just a place that looks kind of green from above.
Right.
So I guess
Thank
I
you,
could
John.
comment. Thanks so much,
Yeah.
Jen. That was so interesting. I suppose most of the work in the canopy has come from a very individual approach, less from that broader picture that satellite images. And I would just chart the history of treetop science being, $300 would fund you for your entire research career with a rope and a harness that I sewed by myself and a slingshot that I welded at the graduate school shop at Sydney University. And most students who go into the canopy start their world in this very humble fashion, simply because there aren't huge amounts of funding, I hate to say it, for forest conservation in so many cases. And we advanced to canopy walkways, which is fantastic, and a few construction cranes and a few inflatables around the world. But again, to really focus in on the biodiversity, we still need what we call ground truthing. I think that's an anomaly, but it means from a satellite image or even a drone image, you can't say which herbivore, which defoliator is killing all the trees, which kind of leaf is that woolly adelgid feeding on the understory or the canopy, and which pollinator is important to the orchid in the tree. So we need this close in kind of research, as well as we need and benefit from the far away research that satellites and drones can give us. And one of the things I've just observed as a female scientist maybe is that we need a level of trust too to work with Indigenous people. They're not so interested in the maps or the charts or the data, but they really want to trust you as an individual and have you spend time with them. I work in Ethiopia, for example, where I spend hundreds of hours praying with priests. It doesn't reward me in my academic career, but it means that I can go gain access to their forests and do things that are really successful on the ground. So I think in the world of science, I'm hoping maybe Evergreen and the Arbornaut can be agents of change. Like, we shouldn't be rewarded just to publish our data. We need to be rewarded for saving forests, for gaining the trust of the individual Indigenous people, and for that type of difference that we can all make to really help conservation. And I'm sure, John, you share the same data that I do, but in half of our lifetime, 50% of the world's forests have disappeared. So our track record isn't very good. You know, we've got to really turn our world upside down and do something different very, very quickly.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk about changing the academic reward system for and recognizing the time it takes to build those relationships. I mean, as both of you have learned, they take a lot longer than even the most elaborate research project to really establish trust across cultures. And that was one of the things I wanted to ask about, because both of these books really, they're different from what we might think of as traditional environmental books, in that they really foreground the people whose cultures depend on these forests, and then the scientific culture that studies these forests. John, I particularly wanted to ask you, was that focus on human culture, was that part of your project with Tom from the beginning, or was that something that became clear that you would address as the project progressed?
It was something that was so natural that I think we didn't even really think about doing anything else. And I learned quickly early in my career that somebody coming into a region, even if it's 5 hours north of here in the California redwoods or in Brazil, what we know compared to the locals is just a tiny, humble fraction. And I was actually involved in bringing a canopy walkway into being in the state of Bahia in Brazil back in the early 90s. And just learned then that the locals know what's going on. But getting to Evergreen, it was something that was important to us, to have the voices of the people who live in, whose ancestors lived in these natural systems, in whose languages knowledge of these places are encoded in ways that can't even be translated really into English. And our best substitute for that is having them speak, and really having them, as you say, in the foreground of the book. And so I think when you do take note of who's speaking in the book, we have some remarkable women, young people, elders who bring these places, hopefully for the reader, bring these places to life. And I think that's important, writing as two guys from the US, to as much as we can step back and let the story tell itself.
I especially love that chapter of yours where you talk about the different words. Well, you go to some trouble to find out what the local word for forest is in several of the places you visit, and in some places that doesn't. It seems to just not quite compute, because people have such an amazing array of really subtle, precise terms for the kinds of forests that surround them.
Well, that's right. I felt like sometimes it's sort of ridiculous asking like an elder in the Cascade Territory in the Yukon, what do you call a forest? And they sit there and they think, and it hits me that what I've taken is this concept forest, clapped a jar on top of it and said, what is this thing in your language? Isolating it from the tundra, isolating it from the rivers, from the lakes, from all these other parts of the landscape. And so their eventual answer, after a lot of sort of back and forth in their language, was, well, we call that among the sticks. So you have this prepositional phrase rather than a noun that describes an experience, not a thing.
Interesting. Related to that, a question for both of you. I know from researching my own book on the history of the conservation movement that the institutional conservation movement has been quite late in recognizing the importance of human relationships to other species. We know a lot about what other species need and what they need from one another, but we're less clear on what other species need from humans and what those relationships look like. For people who might be coming to this idea and who might be thinking, oh, well, isn't a protected forest one that has no people in it? What would you say to them?
Meg, you want to take that?
Sure,
I'll take a shot after you.
Yeah, good. Probably quite the opposite. And I do think it's kind of also begs the question. I've been really lucky to also been mentored by a guy named Edward O. Wilson, who also recently passed away, who was considered the father of biodiversity and proposed this idea that we should save half the earth for 99% of species and the other half for one, which is Homo sapiens. And in discussions over the last 2 years, where I was really privileged to have a lot of lunches with Ed, we agreed that, wait a minute, we can't just save half the earth. We have to save special places in the earth where the biodiversity exists. If we save all the deserts or all the glaciers, we're not really going to achieve the aim of 50% of the earth for all of that 99% biodiversity. So that was for me the impetus for my last chapter in the book, to launch this mission to save these 10 best forests in the world. But in doing that, at the end of the day, it is all about the people that live there, because we call it bottom-up conservation, but without the cooperation of the people that live there, there is no such thing as forest conservation. And I think we've learned through Tom Lovejoy's eyes that, paying the government of Brazil was never a successful way of trying to save forests. So we have to really think harder about the role of scientists and the role of influence. And going back to Ethiopia, where I work a lot, there's only 3% of their forest left in the northern part of the country, but the stewards of that forest, the priests, because all the trees are in the churchyard, had no idea there was only 3% left. No one ever shared a Google Earth image with them. They have no computers and no phones and no electricity. So how on earth would they realize they are sitting on all of the biodiversity of their country right around their little churchyard, unless somehow we work with them? And the one specific thing they said to me when I brought a National Geographic team over to survey the forest, they said, we don't care how much carbon is in the tree. We don't care what the species are. Just please help us save the trees. Their goal is so practical and wonderful. And our Western goals, you see, are allied again back to that academic history, I think. So somewhere we have to really, I think, figure out how science can be applied to conservation in the most practical of ways, because I think we have to do that yesterday. Probably John would agree with that, so I'll turn it over to him.
Oh yeah, completely, Meg. And I think, Michelle, I imagine I could say this better than us, given your writing about it. But our environmentalism in the US, in a sense, was born out of the tragic process of taking the West and creating a landscape without its people. And the drive for these sort of conservation icons, who are my heroes, John Muir, and Aldo Leopold, arrived at this depopulated landscape and thought, what we need to do is protect these empty places. And we've come a long way in recognizing that historical fact, and that today the solution is not protecting empty places. It's protecting places with the full involvement and leadership of the people who are from there and understand those places. In the last several years, in my current job, I work with an indigenous territory in Western Brazil that's about the size of the state of Maine, and has 6 different indigenous tribes that have contact with modern society, and about a dozen groups that are uncontacted.
Oh, wow.
And what I realized when talking to experts about what they call voluntarily isolated peoples in the Amazon is that there are no demographic voids out there. There are no empty forests. There are people who are fully involved in every corner of the Amazon. That doesn't mean that it's a good idea to have lots and lots of people over taxing these systems, but people are part of the landscape, and where they have long histories of deep understanding of how these systems work. Those are the people that our wider society needs to depend on to guide their conservation.
Yeah, as I often think of it, conservation itself is an ecosystem, and for many more than a century now, the conservation movement has sort of operated as this top-down ecosystem that's missing some layers, and we need those. We need the international community of scientists that can use the satellites to measure the extent of these forests, get into the canopy, but we also need that local knowledge, the communities that have been doing conservation long before the conservation movement existed. It's really wonderful actually to see the conservation movement coming to that realization. I think there's been a lot of talk in conservation circles. In fact, more talk, I think, outside North America than inside about Indigenous-led conservation in recent years, something both of you have mentioned already. Is there a misunderstanding about Indigenous-led conservation, or a couple of misunderstandings that you'd like to take the chance to correct? Because that may be a term that people are hearing for the first time or haven't heard much about.
I guess I would say, just based on my work in the Amazon, and I work in the Peruvian Amazon, which is a little more pristine and isolated because it's farther from the mouth of the river. But, having done that for 25 years, the people there see the scientists I bring in, and they would like to have binoculars, and they would like to have iPhones, and they would like their kids to go to college. And, they see the Western ways, and we tempt them. We don't mean to, but they deserve every opportunity they could get. So I think we're putting them in a position that's very awkward, because A, we haven't appreciated their knowledge, but now we do. And B, they would like to use our knowledge and exploit our knowledge, and so they deserve to do that. But how do we reward them with some sustainable income to allow them to do that? So I think we're in this very fragile period about what does conservation mean, because we can't just put a glass dome over these places and hope that people continue to use their medicinal plants, even though they're fabulous. And I, as a botanist, do a lot of work on that subject. I just think we're in a place where we've exposed a lot of people to how the West lives, and I'm not sure that's the way we should live. But it's just the same thing we did in China 50 or 60 years ago, saying you need cars, you need air conditioning, and we will sell it to you. So I feel it's a really awkward, delicate thing for Westerners to go into any community and try to advise and what is the right answer. Somehow the forests are the most important resource. So how can we work with those people to prioritize that between here and there? Because most Americans are not about to make a donation of 10% of their income to save forests, even though they need them for their life. How do we back at home help people realize the importance of forest, as well as the people who live there? So I think it's incumbent on both sides of this kind of discussion that we, pay a price in the Western world, as well as the people who live there. And sometimes we always put the burden on the Indigenous people to save it or to be part of it. And yet they're almost the innocent victims in many cases.
Yeah, very well put. John, anything you'd like
Well,
to add?
I think there are two ways of thinking about Indigenous people doing conservation that are both wrong. One is that they are these sort of pure preservationists that apply their wisdom and never do any harm and sort of reverently gaze at the forest around them. Another caricature is that they're people just like any other people, and they're susceptible to the same wants, needs, desires, and ultimately kinds of interaction with ecosystems. And that given the opportunity, they would cut their forest down just as quick as anybody else. The truth, I think Meg is really putting her finger on, that they do have deep multi-generational, sometimes hundreds of generations of rootedness in these places, and the places are part of them and part of their identity. At the same time, they're curious. They're voracious consumers of new knowledge. They're interested in new technology, and they have ambitions for their kids to be leaders in the community. And often that means being able to interact with the outside community. It means going to law school. It means getting an education of some, various kinds, so that they can really sort of be at the table in negotiating their community's place in the wider society, and that brings its own tensions. And I think that one way that outsiders can help is by doing what we can to help communities maintain their systems of making decisions as groups rather than as individuals. Because that's one of the defining features of the places in the Amazon, like I imagine where Meg works and where I work, is that these are collective territories. And a reason that they are still intact and still thriving is because decisions are made based on what's best for the whole group, rather than what a particular family can extract and exploit from the forest.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to both of you. That's really interesting insights. We're getting some great questions in the chat, and I do want to get to those, not in the chat, I'm sorry, in the Q&A box, and please continue to add those. But before we start in on questions, Meg, I wanted to address something that you talked about at the beginning of in your introduction to the book. As one of your primary motivations for writing the book, we've been talking about these diverse communities that live in the forests and know them intimately. Your experiences in the somewhat less diverse community of the international scientific research community have been at times wonderful and at times appalling. You've run into some really just striking cases of sexism within science. Could you maybe tell us something about what we as a society are missing out on because of that systemic sexism?
Sure. Oh, thanks for letting me speak to that. I was a very naive child. I loved nature, and I didn't even know girls could be scientists. Even worse, I never heard of a rainforest till I went to college. So it just illustrates, I think, the difference in terms of education that was perhaps 50 years ago compared to now. And when I did go off to grad school, the first thing the head of the department said to me is, "Why in the heck are you wasting your time when you'll just get married and have children?" And he meant that from his heart. He wasn't making fun of me. He just thought that was the way of the world. And I learned that was most of the way of the scientific community at the time. So I just quietly did my thing, and I had really a lot of stress and a lot of challenge. I, found myself as the only girl in Cameroon on an expedition with 50 scientists using that hot air balloon. But once in a while, I would find myself as the only person the village trusted, because they loved seeing the pictures of my children in the indigenous villages, and they loved deferring to the only female as the person of trust. So there were little tiny golden threads along the way of this life of challenge. But as I mentioned, from all my heart, I hope that by writing about this, which took me my whole career to dare to write that, because I thought I would lose my job 15 years ago if I wrote about any situation where I didn't have, fair treatment. So by writing it at the end of my career, at least the next generation can benefit. But I think it illustrates the fact that there's still not inclusivity, and it's caused me to include kids in wheelchairs in canopy research. It's caused me to really mentor a lot of minority students along the way when I had professorial duties, just because I think having more voices at the table will be better for conservation. I don't have proof of that. I just have a sense in my heart that if we have those more diverse voices at the table, maybe we can work harder at being successful to save our big trees. So that's a really huge impetus for me to spend 3 years to write this book.
As I talk to younger scientists, and I'm sure this is your experience too, many of them, and people of all genders are very concerned with, they're very passionate about wanting to make science more equitable. What advice would you have for young women and men who are coming up in the field, who want to make science more equitable?
Sure.
What should they do?
Well, I would, based on my own personality, which was very shy and reticent, I would say be bold and be brave and speak up if you have the chance, and try really hard to do that. But I would also say for women and minorities, support each other. I too often do see women leaders not supporting the young women because they think they should suffer as much as they did. I think we have to really reach out and support each other. And that was the one funny thing I had with Tom Lovejoy, is he was in that privileged sex, boarding school and male and science. It was all like sort of presented. And I was always like, Tom, how can I change my gender? This is ridiculous. It was just pretty different, our pathways. And so I think if women help other women, we have groups in the Ecological Society. I was honored to be part of a group helping start a group called Seeds, where we had minority students that mentored each other and minority faculty that mentored young students. I think we have to pay critical attention to giving people role models and opportunities to have colleagues that they will become supportive of each other. And I think that's really, really critical.
Yeah, well put. We have about 15 minutes left. Let's go to some of the questions in the Q&A box, and do please keep adding them. There's a great assortment of questions and perspectives here. First, a question from someone in Charlottesville, Makshia. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your first name. Glad to have you all here. I'm a poet studying the canopy cover here in Charlottesville. How have your books and research shifted or expanded your methodologies? I suppose I'm asking how your work and collaborations shift the way you approach your work and collaborations. Thank you. So yeah, how have your collaborations with others, John, with this book, or Meg in your work in many ways, how have those collaborations shifted the way you approach your own research, I think is the question.
John, you can go first. I'll follow you if you like.
Okay, Meg, thanks. I think for me, what this makes me think of is I studied economics in grad school, and that really became the set of tools that I employed as a conservationist. And through collaborations with others and just the mounting evidence, I remain convinced that those are highly important tools for strategy and for interacting with development agencies. But I really became convinced that economics as a discipline is woefully inadequate in understanding the full meaning and value of large-scale ecosystems to people. The discipline is sort of has the pretense of saying this is to understand the interaction of people and the resources that they use, as if that were the end all and be all of humans' relationships to the non-human world. And so I think my interactions with biologists, indigenous peoples, and just sensible humans have made me put economics in its place as a tool, but we have to approach these problems with a much broader mindset, because the economic logic has gotten us to where we are now, which is not a good place. And so one thing that we talk about in the book is the need to take all the sorts of measures that you hear on the news every day about how we're doing as a society, how the economy is doing, as if that is our well-being, and change those, insert nature, insert forests into the things that we measure every week, every month, sort of the breathless report on the Dow Jones every hour, and pay attention to those things.
Right. What's the daily report on the state of the forest? That would be something, right, to have in the Chiron every day.
Amazing.
So, Meg, anything you'd like to add to that?
I am very, very outspoken about this topic. I mean, I do think the collaborations is the secret to success. And I think, again, I'll take full responsibility as a scientist that for all too long, we scientists have communicated to each other and not outside of our own communities. And I think that's been a woeful mistake. And for me, the biggest successes have been in very diverse collaborations. You know, Saving the Forests of Ethiopia is a huge partnership with the Coptic Church. It's not a scientific partnership. I had worked with an Irish symphony musician, and we created a symphony about the canopy, which is fantastic and very meaningful. I've written some children's books with artists, and that ended up to, you know, reach a different audience. And so I think at the end of the day, we need to really train scientists to think outside of the box. I've spoken to business schools, which is such a privilege, because usually these high-powered zillionaires come up to me later and say, oh my gosh, I had no idea a tree was worth anything except some kind of, you know, sort of aesthetic piece in my backyard. They never got taught the value of a tree for water quality or for soil conservation or carbon storage. So until we can have these really great collaborations outside of the box, I'm not sure we can save our forests. And that's a scary thing to admit, but we've just got to push for them a little more aggressively.
Yeah, just to second what both of you are saying, that's what came home to me again and again as I was working on my own book, is science can tell us so much about what other species need, but in the end, conservation is accomplished by people, and we need to know how to support people in you know, living sustainably alongside other species, and we just, conservation hasn't gotten there yet, and no one discipline can tell us. We need multiple disciplines and multiple perspectives on that, because it's such an incredibly complex problem. Moving on to the next question from Natasha. I am from Mozambique, and I work in the Miombo woodlands, the major forest ecosystem in the region. It's amazing how the ecology of Miombo has been shaped by human activities, Sweden agriculture, honey production, etc. These socio-ecological relationships are super important and complex for both ecosystems and people. There is no way we should separate them in conservation. The main issue is how we provide options for the rural poor to adapt to a changing world. For example, what are the alternatives to slash and burn agriculture? And then she adds, thanks, John and Meg, for an inspiring conversation and your views on this very important matter. So more of a comment than a question, but anything you'd like to add there?
Well, I'd love to comment, because Mozambique is actually the next place I'm going to after Madagascar, with this last chapter in the book that's called Mission Green, about building, fundraising and building these canopy walkways to then employ local families to be the ecotourism guides, and then in turn fund students to come and make the discoveries, especially local students. Mozambique, in particular, Gorongosa National Park, which was a site of choice for Ed Wilson during his life, is a place where one of his board members named Greg Carr is pledged to help us build a canopy walkway there and use the local girls and families to be the guide. So after we finish a walkway in Madagascar, which is extremely urgent because less than 3% of the forest is left in Madagascar, we hope to do that in Mozambique, which is an amazing country. And I think in a lot of cases, there are these countries that are underappreciated or underfunded. I hate to say it, but Americans love to go to Costa Rica or Panama where it's convenient and safe. But we have these amazing countries with this amazing biodiversity that perhaps isn't getting an equal share of the conservation dollars. So I think if we can try to focus on what countries need our help most specifically, it's great. And I'm really excited if we can make inroads for Mozambique, which has got such a fabulous endemic, as they call it, unique to them biodiversity. So thank you for listening out there. And I hope to meet you someday.
John, anything you'd like to add?
No, that was beautifully put. I would just add Bolivia to that list of underappreciated and unbelievable countries.
Neat.
A couple of questions I'm going to combine because they're perhaps asking the same thing at different scales. Susan asks, what can we do to save the big forest? And I would say both of you address that big question in your books. We can talk about it a little bit here. And then David asks somewhat more specifically, a recent scientific article claims that the Amazon rainforest is nearing a tipping point, that it may become savanna and other non-forest types of landscape. Do you agree that a tipping point is near? And if so, in broad terms, how can the international community take steps to avoid reaching this tipping point? So advice on the big picture of saving forests, and then specific to the Amazon, what can be done by individuals and by the international community?
Yeah, I'll take the first crack at that one. So unfortunately, the person who really should be answering the tipping point question is Tom. But his work with Carlos Nobre and others in Brazil has shown the effect of the Amazon's weather pattern on, let's see, I'll explain it like this. So the weather moves from east to west in the Amazon. And what it does is the moisture from the ocean falls as rain in the forest, gets recycled back up into the clouds, falls again a little bit further west, and does this a half dozen times on the way to the Andes. So if the forests are gone in the eastern Amazon, which they are increasingly being cut down, you have an effect on this whole cycle as it moves westward in the Amazon. And so you have, where I work in the far western part of Brazil on the border with Peru, the forests are getting drier. On the tipping point question, I think it's important to clarify that as that dynamic takes place, it's not like the whole Amazon is going to turn into a savanna. There may be drying to the point that parts of the Amazon make that switch. So sometimes this is presented in the media like the whole ecosystem is about to disappear. It's bad, but not that bad. And then the part of the question on what we can do, I'd really divide us as people into two categories. There are people who are pulling the levers of public policy. They are deciding about expansion of protected areas, indigenous land rights, building more infrastructure into the forest, permitting. Now, the big issue in Brazil today is gold mining, other kinds of mining being permitted in indigenous lands. So those kinds of things, there are clear right answers on those sorts of policies in the big forests around the world. Now, what can you and I do if we're not pulling on those policy levers? Everybody can help. What you do as a consumer and your personal carbon footprint matters to the forests. And it matters not just because the forests are susceptible to the effects of climate change, but because these forests are where people go to dig up gold, to dig up copper, to drill for oil, to extract timber, to plant oil palm, to plant soybeans. The less we need of all of these things, the less pressure there will be on the forest. So if somebody tells you your personal actions don't matter, it's just not true. And above all, they matter for showing the policymakers that there's a demand in the general public for us to all do better.
Yeah, that was
Thank you.
well spoken, John. I would sure echo that. Obviously, working in places like Ethiopia where one American energy footprint equals 17 Ethiopians, we have a lot to answer for. And people say to me, oh, shame on those Africans. They have too big a family. And I'm like, are you kidding me? People don't understand that our consumerism is what's driving deforestation. And if we could drill down and check every time you buy soy or beef, where did it come from? Don't buy products, especially makeup and plastic and all kinds of things that have palm oil. We could turn deforestation around. American consumerism really is driving so much deforestation. Now, that's a tough thing to do because people have to write to their governments and say, could you label products a little bit better? But why couldn't we? I mean, why do we say to ourselves, that's impossible, I'm not going to do anything? What about shade-grown coffee? What about, ensuring that we buy timber that's been grown in plantations in North America, not illegally coming from ships from the Amazon? So I feel very strongly that we have so much to answer for that could be taken on. I give several dozen school talks every month to kids, because there's a children's book that's written about me that's in the United States Science Standards curriculum. So I get smart teachers find me. Unfortunately, it keeps me very busy in my volunteer life. But the kids all want to know what they can do. And what if all the kids in the country took on the fact that forget buying soy that comes from Brazil anymore, and we insisted our policymakers label it? So there are a lot of things that we could do. But for starters, I think it's great if people are reading books like John's and mine and maybe learning about the forest, starting to understand the importance, and hopefully adding in that sustainable consumption action that really needs to happen in our country so strongly. And I don't know how it'll happen. I wish Tom were alive, and I'd like to ask him that question right now. How could we insist that our governments do better for giving us better labels on products? That would help so much.
Thank you, Megan. Thanks to you both. We're getting close to our time where we have to wrap up, but this has been a rich conversation. And I'll just say to those of you who are listening, it's just a appetizer for these two great books, which go into a lot more detail and tell many vivid stories about the experience of doing science, the experience of doing groundbreaking or cloud breaking science, perhaps, and of firsthand experiences in these forests that many of us will never get to see, but can be awed and excited and comforted that they still exist. So I will say, I'll add that even though these books both talk about really challenging global problems, they're both books about huge opportunities, huge scientific opportunities and huge conservation opportunities. And in that sense, they're very hopeful. So anything either of you would like to leave us with before we wrap up?
I'd love to say one thing and give John 30 seconds as well, but I think in his book points this out, and hopefully mine does too. It's really important to save big trees. I think we are all falling short by saying, oh, you can cut a big tree down and just plant 2 little ones. A koala bear can't live on a eucalyptus seedling. It takes 100 or 200 years for a tree to develop a canopy that supports the biodiversity that the planet needs. So this excuse of cutting a tree down to plant little ones is not good enough. And it's great to plant trees, but do not in your community allow big trees to be taken down. And this is a giant epidemic in North America for roads, for malls, for people adding to their garages or their houses. And they should be treated like the most important senior citizens ever and given that huge status. And I just hope both of our books might bring that home to more people.
Yeah, really important point. More and more, I think those of us who are following the climate change story are hearing the words nature-based solutions and carbon offsets. And I think it's really important to add to look at what exactly are we talking about? Are we talking about keeping big trees, or are we talking about planting small ones that will take, as you say, decades for them to realize their carbon benefits? So, John.
Yeah, totally second what Meg just said. On a global scale, people often see reforestation as a viable plan B to saving our forests, but it's not. It's a necessary thing that we need to do to bring back some of the carbon on the ground that has been sent up to the atmosphere already. But it is a second tier action that we need to take after we've secured our big trees and big forests. And yeah, beyond that, I just wanted to express my gratitude to the Virginia Festival for the book, and how cool it is to be on the stage with Meg. And thank you for guiding us here, Michelle.
Thanks to you both. Yeah, unfortunately, it's time to wrap up. So thanks to everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Meg and John, for being with us and helping us kick off the festival. Do consider buying these books from your local bookseller. Best of all, using the links provided in the chat that you'll see there. And you can explore the rest of the book festival schedule, which runs through March 20th at vabook.org. So thanks again. Happy reading. And I wish you all a wonderful time at the festival to come. Take care.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thank you, John and Meg.